In this video, I will look at the year-to-date performance of Halal ETFs and compare them to the S&P 500. If you do like this type of content, then do subscribe for more content like this. The ETFs I will be using to represent the S&P 500 is VUSA and VUSD, which are both available in the UK. It's important to know that these are the same ETFs but in different currencies. VUSA is in pounds and VUSD is in dollars. These currency differences will impact your return, and as you will see, you can see that it can be a significant percentage amount in terms of difference. The S&P 500 is considered to represent the market as it consists of 500 US companies that make up its economy, but this is not permissible to invest in for Muslims because they contain companies that are involved in interest and alcohol. The alternative for Muslims is to use Halal ETFs. I've made plenty of videos on this channel about Halal ETFs, so do check those out. But in this video, I will just be comparing the performance of them to the S&P 500. The first ETF is a popular one and one of the best performing Halal ETFs. It is the Invesco Dow Jones ETF, ticker symbol IGDA. As you can see, the year-to-date performance is 23.38%. So this is as at the 6th of December 2024. So it's definitely performed really well. And over the last 6 months, it's gone up over 9%. This is a popular ETF which I have actually made another video on. So do make sure you check that out. But basically this is sort of like an S&P 500. Because you have similar companies in the top 10 holdings. So you have Apple, Nvidia and Microsoft as the biggest holdings, and then there's also Amazon, Meta and Alphabet, and then there's a smaller portion of Tesla here. So I believe all of these are part of the Magnificent Seven, which is what has really driven the markets in the 2024 year. And in terms of the weightings, as you'd expect, it's mainly technology, which again has been driving the market. And as you can see, it is in US dollars. So that's probably also one of the reasons for its gain, as I believe the ETFs in this currency have been particularly performing better than the equivalent pound version. Also, you can see it says ACC, which means accumulating. So this ETF does not pay out a dividend, instead it reinvests it. And if you've been following my channel, you know that this is in one of my top 2 holdings. So this is actually my second largest position in my portfolio. Also note that this ETF is a worldwide ETF, so it's not just invested in the US, whereas those 2 ETFs which I mentioned previously that were tracking the S&P 500 were only based in the US, because the S&P 500 is only companies that are in the US. So if we look back at our initial table, I also had another row that was highlighted, and that's VWRP, which is basically a sort of equivalent world ETF. But again, this isn't permissible to invest in for the same reasons as I mentioned for the other 2 ETFs. But as you can see, the world ETFs in general have not performed as well as the US market. So IGDA has actually performed the best in terms of the world market. So we'll find out what the top ETF is. But for the moment, we can see that in terms of the world market, IGDA has performed the best. The next ETF I will be looking at is the worst performing ETF on this list, and that is ISUS, which is the iShares MSCI USA Islamic ETF, And as you can guess from the name, this is a US based ETF. So although I did mention that VUSD and VUSA, which are US based ETFs, have outperformed the world markets such as VWRP, we can see in this case a US Halal ETF has actually underperformed. So although this ETF has underperformed the other equivalent US ETFs, we can actually see if we go back over a longer period, so let's say 5 years, we can see that this ETF has actually been pretty stable in comparison. So if we just take 2022 as an example, I'll just highlight the period, and we can see during this period that the ETF did not really move much. So it was around 0.14% or maybe 0.76% if we go into the new year. So if we look at an equivalent S&P 500 ETF during this time period, we can see that it dropped around 7.8%. And if we go into the new year, which is what I did in the previous one, it is around 6.84%. So this particular graph is the VUSA stock, which is sort of an equivalent style as it's in pounds, and ISUS is also in pounds. So we can see, although it hasn't performed as good in 2024 during the down period, it also has not performed as bad. And if we look at its top 10 holdings, it actually isn't very similar to the S&P 500, because as you can see, the top holding is Microsoft, and that accounts to around a quarter of the ETF, whereas in the other S&P 500 ETF we have companies such as Apple, such as Nvidia, and Amazon and Google, which are part of the Magnificent Seven. So in here we've only really got one of or two of those Magnificent Seven companies. We've got Microsoft and Tesla, which is also a big portion of the portfolio. So that's around 6%, and 25% I believe is quite high for a single company. So I'm not sure if they will rebalance the portfolio, but it seems to have been the same for quite a long time now. I do believe a few years ago Johnson & Johnson was at one point the biggest holding, and I think over the past 2 to 3 years or so, it's been pretty much the same. And as you can see, it's mainly based in the US, 92%. So I'm not sure why it has Ireland in it, but I'm assuming because this ETF is actually based in Ireland, so that's why I'm assuming there's a percentage. I'm not sure what that relates to. And then in sectors we've got technology, so that's 45%, which as you can see mainly comes from Microsoft, and then you'll have other big tech companies as well. So Salesforce, I'm assuming, will also be part of that. Cisco Systems will also be classed as technology. And then the second biggest holding is energy, and then you've got healthcare. But in terms of the top holding, technology, that's I believe a lot more than what the S&P 500 has, and even a lot more than the first Halal ETF that we looked at. Before I get into the next Halal ETF, please can I ask you to like and subscribe if you are enjoying the content. The next ETF I will be looking at is AMAP, which is the Saturna Al Kauthar World ETF. Year to date, it is up 17.06%. If we look at the top 10 holdings of this ETF, we can see that it's not very similar to the other ETFs that we have looked at, whether that's the S&P 500 or even the ISUS ETF, because we don't have much of the Magnificent Seven companies. So we've obviously got Microsoft and Alphabet, but the combined weighting of these two is only around 6%, and no weighting is more than 5%, whereas in the last ETFs we had weightings more than this. So obviously in ISUS we had a huge weighting with over 25%, but even before that in IGDA there was weightings of around 7 or 6% for Apple and Microsoft, which is similar to the S&P 500. So here, if we just look at the top holding, it's Taiwan Semiconductor, which is a popular semiconductor company. And then the second biggest holding is Train Technologies, which I honestly haven't really heard too much about. And then you've got these other companies such as Johnson Controls International, which again, I'm not too familiar with this company. And you've got these other companies such as Boston Scientific Corp. But my point is that these companies are not very well known, especially when you compare them to the other ETFs and the big market cap companies. So these companies aren't as well known, but still it has performed pretty well year to date. So we've got 17.06% year to date. And then over the past 1 year, we've got 21%. And then over the past 5 years, we've got around 19%. And if we just go back to look at the countries that this ETF is based in, we can see just under 50% is based in the US, which again is different to the previous ETFs, which had a lot more weighting in the US. So there's about 9% in Ireland, then you've got around 6% in the UK. But there's around 29% in other, so it's interesting to see what this is comprised of. So we've got France, Japan, Germany, Canada, but they don't really split the other countries. So that's around 16.3%. So that could be maybe other countries in Europe or maybe even emerging markets. And if we go further down, we can see the sectors that they are involved in. So again, the biggest sector, which seems to be a common theme in these ETFs and in general, as is with the S&P 500, that the main sector is technology, which, as I've mentioned, has been driving the market over the past year or so. And we've got actually a huge amount allocated to healthcare. And again, we've got a lot in other. And if I see what this is comprised of, again, there's not really much more of a breakdown. We've got other as 16%, but it's not clear exactly which sectors these are involved in. So this ETF is sort of different to the other ETFs, but it has performed pretty well. And if you look at the holdings as well, it only has 44 holdings, which is not very high compared to the other ETFs. So this is actually an interesting one to look at just because it's different to the rest. The next halal ETF I will be looking at is HLAL, which is the Wahid FTSE USA Sharia ETF. This has gone up over 20% year to date. We can see that the top 10 holdings again are very similar to some of the other ETFs we have looked at. So you've got Apple, the top holding. You've got Microsoft, which is around 13%. And then you've got Meta, Google, Tesla, and Alphabet, which again are some of the Magnificent Seven companies. I don't think Nvidia is on there, but outside of that, you've got those companies. And the sector weightings, again, the top performer is technology. And then you've got communication services. And then you've got healthcare, consumer cyclical, etc. Now that we have gone through these ETFs on my list, we will now go to the best performing ETF, which has outperformed the rest of the list. But before I do that, please can I ask you to subscribe, as only 5% of my viewers are actually subscribed, and it motivates me to make more content. This halal ETF has gone up a whopping 30% this year, which I believe is higher than any S&P 500 equivalent. This ETF is the SP Funds S&P Sharia ETF, and the ticker symbol is SPUS. I don't think this is actually available in the UK. The top 10 holdings are again very similar to the other ETFs we have looked at. You've got Apple as the biggest holding, and then the second biggest holding is Nvidia, which I'm assuming where the performance has come from. As we know, Nvidia has really outperformed this year. And then you've obviously got some of the other Magnificent Seven companies. You've got Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Google, and Tesla. And again, the sector ratings are very similar to the other ETFs that we've looked at. The biggest sector obviously being technology, which again has driven the market this year. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. it was really just a quick rundown of the best performing halal ETFs versus the S&P 500. I may have missed some ETFs. If I have done, then please let me know in the comments below and I will take a look at those as well. And also, if you do have any other suggestions for videos or any content that you do want me to cover, also let me know in the comments below and I may make a video.